All right, this is Mr. P. I'm back where we left off from, what was it, lesson 4? And so this would be lesson 5. This is the 5th video here. So I picked up where we left off, just as a reminder. I quickly went through the Tulsa Massacre. So make sure that you have watched that video and learned more about the Tulsa Massacre. And I had left off by talking about the way in which Black veterans resisted by arming themselves and defending themselves against mob violence. That's such an important piece to this story. These massacres didn't occur with Black folks, just kind of saying, I'll accept it. And also it helps us understand the way in which armed self-defense has a long history in Black history, right? It wasn't just started with the Black Panthers in the 1960s. Armed self-defense is used during this period by Black veterans. Sometimes they even broke into armories to, arm themselves and form, in DC. They even perched themselves on rooftops as like snipers ready to take out, white mobs. Should that happen. So, this was a really intense time period. So that's important to mention. The next section, this video is going to mostly look at resistance, but we have one more slide before we get there. And we're going to be looking at some of the ways in which white terror and lynchings used the brute caricature to justify their violence. Which means we will be touching on the ways in which the mythology and caricature of a aggressive Black man who is threatening, who is assaulting, who is trying to attack and rape white women, that caricature is used to justify this violence. Because we're going to be talking about that, this is a difficult content in this video. Just wanted to kind of let you know that. The other thing I want to say is, we know that, people of any race can, attack or harm anybody of another race. What we're talking about in the case of lynchings is the lack of willingness to investigate accusations of crime, often because those crimes were made up in those particular instances and used simply to justify the lynching outside of the court system. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that these lynchings are happening as an extrajudicial way of maintaining white supremacy and using crimes and fear-mongering as a way to justify it. So what we're so I want to mention here in this slide the role that a particular movie played. This is D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation of 1915. This movie is one of the most racist white supremacist movies created in U.S. history. It represents the lost cause myths, which we learned about with the Daughters of Confederacy. It tells lies about the so-called evil of Reconstruction. It perpetuates many stereotypes and characters of Black people, especially Black men, in the brute caricature. And because it portrays this brute caricature, it ignites a resurgence of the KKK, making white people feel as though they have to defend their communities from Black people. Despite its explicit white supremacist content, President Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House in the late 1900s. Woodrow Wilson was a president who was, very friendly with known white supremacists and harbored some of that ideology himself. And he screened this video open. It was a private screening, but, it was unabashed screening of this video in the White House. That tells us something about, where our federal government was at the time. They had abandoned and continued to abandon Black communities since Reconstruction. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that's the language they would have used at the time, organized protests against this movie, trying to get it banned. So they organized protests and letter writing campaigns at the time. So we're going to talk about resistance to lynching, the fight against lynching. First thing I want to highlight is this poem called Strange Fruit. It's a song. You probably know it as a song sung by Nina Simone or Billie Holiday. I have the YouTube links for Billie Holiday and Nina Simone's performances of this song. I highly recommend listening to both. I think they're both incredible. Billie Holiday, a Harlem Renaissance era Black singer, Black bisexual singer, really important figure in the Harlem Renaissance period, somebody I encourage you to do more research on. It can be difficult to research her. She has a history of mental health, kind of both singers have a history of that. So just be aware of that as you kind of read more about them, but they're both fabulous, fantastic singers. And so I recommend that you take a look at their videos. You can learn more about the story behind Strange Fruit in these two links. Strange Fruit is a poem actually written by a white man, Abel Meeropol, who sees a photograph like this one, a spectacle lynching, where white folks are gawking at the lynching, and he writes a poem in response, and it was an act of white resistance in many ways to this. And then Billie Holiday takes up the poem as a song. So that song Strange Fruit refers to Black folks who are hung on these trees. So it's a really jarring song, and I encourage you to listen to it. So now we're going to talk about Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is probably one of my most favorite leaders, individual leaders of the that we study in this course. She uses investigative journalism as a tool to fight back against lynching and to fight back against anti-Black violence. And I want you to pause the video now and go to open up the slides and follow this YouTube link, which I'm also posting directly linked into Google Classroom. So you can follow this link and watch this video about Ida B. Wells. It's a TED animated 4-minute video where you can learn more about her. So do that first, take some notes, and then come back. So hopefully you're back, and we'll continue. So she published her research. She went to as you learned in the video, she went to over 700 sites where lynching occurred. Super dangerous as a Black woman to do. Ida B. Wells was incredibly courageous and did this work to make sure that the truth got told. And she published those truths in a series of articles, a newspaper, and a report she called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. This was her effort to combat the myths that the Black people who were being lynched were committing crimes. People believe this, not just white people. Frederick Douglass, right? Frederick Douglass said that he believed that the reason Black folks were lynched was because they committed crimes, until he talked to Ida B. Wells and read her work. And it was her work that really jolted people into realizing lynching was a tool to maintain white supremacy. These Black folks being lynched were not committing crimes. They were not being prosecuted through the court system because they weren't committing crimes, and lynching was used to simply kill people, to keep people in their place, and used as a terror tactic. So take note of that. There were Black leaders who believed the lies too. And Ida B. Wells even speaks truth to that power, the power of someone like Frederick Douglass. So that's part of why I just, adore her and think she's incredible. She's able to speak truth in her journalism as a form of resistance here. So I'm going to ask you to, pause here too and go to the slides, since this box covers up some of it. And I want you to consider what this source reveals about the real causes of lynchings. It details the story of the grocers, the black grocers, in Memphis, that Ida B. Wells knew. From the video. So take a moment to pause. I'm not going to read this to you, but I want you to read this source, which is it's one of the things published in her Southern Horrors text, and she in it pay attention to the way in which these three black men at the People's Grocery were targeted because they were competing with white grocer, right? They were challenging white economic power and trying to carve out a space for their own, economic power. And that was a way in which that made them susceptible to being targeted for lynching. So pay attention to that. It's a really important lesson here. So you can pause, read this, and then come back for the rest of our discussion of Ida B. Wells.